aim here was to challenge the traditional notions of masculinity and femininity, right? So we're slowly moving again in a more progressive direction. And this is going to rely heavily on the idea that these notions of masculinity and femininity are not just parts of our unconscious mind, right, that maybe we've hidden or whatnot, but that they actually come from outside of us, right? They're socially constructed and then we internalize them. And so this leads us to a larger categorization that runs throughout these movements as men who would be considered pro-feminist within them or anti-feminist. So to give you a sense of what pro-feminist men in these movements would have looked like, right? They were the ones really pushing the issue of who could say they are a feminist. And, so they get a lot of credit for challenging the idea that to be a feminist, you had to be a woman, right? So the idea is that a man could very much be a feminist, even if they weren't a woman or weren't, falling outside of what it meant to be a cis man or to be heterosexual or anything like this, right? That you need not be perhaps part of one of the marginalized groups in order to consider yourself a feminist. And so they aim to challenge the notion that you must be the subject of oppression or inequalities to be considered a feminist. Nowadays, there's a lot of discussion around terms like allies and things like this. So these are conversations that have been happening for a long time, right? Who gets to use what labels? Since, of course, those labels do a lot of work, and we use them to express a lot of our ideology, and so it's going to be important, right? Who is allowed to have those labels and who isn't. And so pro-feminist men at this time wanted to be considered feminist because they were primarily concerned with violence against women, specifically sexual violence, as well as the ways in which certain types of products were consumed by men which might have oppressed women in certain ways, much like the discussion around pornography, right? So what are ways in which men can consume these types of products that does not make them anti-feminist, right? And so there's been a lot of discussion just in that industry in particular, which you can explore if you're interested. But the idea here is that is there a way in which, what it means to be a man can occur in the world without it being connected with these things, right? Can a cisgendered man, heterosexual, be a feminist, right? By taking up these issues, right? Helping to address them in certain ways. So this is as opposed to men who in some of these movements, primarily the earlier ones, specifically the mythopoetic one, would be considered anti-feminist. Not to say that there couldn't be anti-feminist men in the Jungian or gay men's movement, right? But to be an anti-feminist would mean that you are rejecting or reacting against one of the feminist principles that we talked about earlier in the quarter, specifically the normative claim or the descriptive claim, right? So you could be anti-feminist in that you think there is no gender inequality, or you could be anti-feminist in thinking, well, there is, but it's supposed to be that way. And so, unfortunately, most of these anti-feminist men fought against the normative claim, right? So they did acknowledge, many of them did acknowledge that there was gender inequality, but thought that that was the natural way that things should be, right? So they thought that the existing social arrangements, such as they were and such as they are, being patriarchal, right, with men maintaining most, if not all, positions of power in the social hierarchy, were not just natural, but a lot of this ends up being tied in with religion, and thus that they thought that it was divinely planned, right? So however things are is how God or gods, right, whatever religion someone might be operating under, that this is how God wanted it to be, and so who are we to change it, right? So this is, again, a reaction against feminists' moves to try to correct that oppression, correct that marginalization, right? And so they did advocate for social arrangements that favored men, and specifically they thought that action should be taken simply to make these arrangements more equitable, right? So they want these social arrangements to exist, and they might be open to adjusting them a little bit, but the idea is primarily, though, that they're going to be concerned with the equity for men. So they're going to be mostly concerned with men who have been left out of the existing hierarchy, more so than the fact that women, and primarily people of color, right, have been left out. And so their aims in this case were not to advocate for gender equality, but to actively oppose women's equality, right? Because again, as we saw with the mythopoetic account, they saw women's movements towards equality as being part of the problem that men were facing. And this happens a lot in any instance of social inequality where someone who has been historically oppressed is trying to correct, right, or is gaining assistance in correcting for that injustice. The previously privileged group, they don't see themselves all often as that privileged. And so when other individuals start gaining ground to maybe catch up a little bit, they somehow see this as something being taken away from them, right? So we're seeing this a lot now in discussions against immigration, right? So somehow, allowing refugees and immigrants into the country who are fleeing persecution, right, who are looking for better lives, looking for opportunities, even for individuals who have nothing to do with them, right? They don't have a job that they're losing to them. There are plenty of instances where, farmers in the United States have said, like, we're not going to hire anyone except American citizens, and American citizens didn't even want the job. Like, we're not even talking about, right, competing for the same resources.